Our first keynote speaker today is Ben Afia. Most organizations don't connect with their customers and staff half as well as they could. As a result, they're losing customers and employers at a shocking rate. So our next speaker is the language strategist who has helped companies like Vodafone, Aviva, Google to be more human and make that connection. He's going to reveal how language is the key that will unlock the door to a more authentic brand and happier customers. To refresh your language, please welcome Ben Afia.
Thank you, Ricky. Well, today I'm going to talk about refreshing our language. I'm going to give you some ideas, whether your business is large or small, but I'm going to start by looking at old language through the lens of archaeology. Yeah, archaeology is about peeling back layers of history, finding things that people maybe haven't seen for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And when you think of archaeologists, what comes to mind? Maybe Indiana Jones, the wide brim hat, the leather whip, global adventure. Well, it's 1993 and I find myself on a dig. And we know that William the Conqueror landed at Hastings and duffed up the English, but it was actually just up the road at Pevensey where he built his first castle. And it was Pevensey's castle that we were excavating. Now, I'd done a dig the year before, so I was considered deeply experienced. And so I was entrusted with a special mission. And my mission was to excavate Pevensey Castle's cesspit. Yeah, who would have thought the thick beard and the gold-rimmed specs would come back into fashion 30 years later? Actually, they probably weren't in fashion back then, were they? Anyway, you might not think that cesspits are very cool things to excavate, but archaeologically, they are actually really good because over hundreds of years, lots of treasure gets dropped in all that crap. So you get the remains of food, you get pottery, you even get jewelry. So if your partner ever says, "Oh, I've lost my wedding ring," maybe check down the toilet. Anyway, what we didn't know was whether the cesspit had been excavated before. So the deal with English Heritage was that either we'd get to excavate all the treasure or we'd clear out all the muck. How do you think that summer went for me? Yeah, I spent it chief in charge of shoveling poo. So I'm going to come back to this, but I'm going to leave you with a question. What do you think that William the Conqueror has to do with the language that we speak in business amongst ourselves and with our clients to this day? You know, I've always been interested in the origins of English, where language comes from. And when you look back, it's easier to see, but when we're immersed in it, it's quite hard to see what's really going on. So this is what I'm hoping to do for you today. I found there are 4 things that you need to do to focus on to help your business to be more human. And that's my focus. That's my passion. We need to look at our culture. We need to think about our brand. That then reflects in how we communicate and it reflects in our behavior with the people we work with and with our customers and our clients. So let's start with a question about culture. What can language help us to see in our culture that we might not otherwise? What I found really interesting about learning about how early humans evolved was understanding how intelligence came up and how language was created. We evolved language in order to cooperate effectively and compete in hunter-gatherer societies. We lived in much smaller societies in those days and the environment was much more harsh. So we needed to belong to the tribe. So we adopted the language of that tribe in order to belong, to be a part of it. If you got rejected by the tribe, you probably wouldn't live for very long. So adopting the language of the tribe was crucial. Let's speed this up to modern day a little bit. So if you've got teenagers, anyone with teenagers in the audience, I think there are a few. Well, I tried to use the word peng with my 14-year-old daughter recently. And if you don't know, this is what peng means. It's kind of hot or buff or sexy, something like that. Anyway, the look of horror that Lottie gave me was enough to put me firmly in my place and not use that word ever again. Middle-aged dad. So with teenagers, they have tribes. And they adopt a language of that tribe, and the language tells you who's in and who's out. But it's not just teenagers, is it? In our organizations, in our companies, in our professions, there are languages. There are all sorts of tribes within business. So, for example, we have the classic HR tribe. Actually, they're less formal these days, especially if they're called people. I'm working with a people director at the moment. She's much more relaxed. We have the IT tribe. So my son is thinking about a career in IT. Boy, there's a lot of language for him to learn there. And us marketers are used to making up language left, right, and centre as we like. So we're creating new jargon all of the time, aren't we? There's all sorts of stuff coming up. But there's a serious point to this. So 20 years or so, I joined Boots the Chemist to manage writing. And in meetings, people kept talking about the stores. And I was imagining a huge warehouse where all the stock was kept. I was really confused about this word. And eventually I thought, I'm not getting this right. So in an important meeting with some senior people, I ended up putting my hand up and saying, I'm sorry, but where are the stores? And somebody said, no, Ben, the stores are the shops. But nobody had actually told me. So we have language within companies, and the language tells you who's in and who's out. And we're busy creating new jargon all of the time, aren't we? So a few years ago, I was working with Google, and I met a few Googlers. They have the Googleplex. They have Google Maps, or more commonly known as we know where you live and what you're up to. And I was speaking recently to a Swedish artificial intelligence audience about software that can do writing for you. I'm sort of curious to find out, how soon software is going to get rid of me, how long I'm going to have a job for. And what was interesting about this is that software can actually read things like choice of words, it can read sentence length, it can even read active and passive verbs, but it struggles to read the emotional meaning behind language. Now, this isn't particularly surprising, is it? Because us humans find this difficult, don't we? Sometimes it's hard to understand what people are on about, what they really mean. So a little while ago, I was working with Vodafone's Indian contact centres, and the problem that they were having was understanding us passive-aggressive Brits, because we don't really like to say what we truly mean, do we? We hide it. And so these guys in India, they're mostly graduates, they have very good English, but they were struggling to understand the emotional context. And when a British customer was actually really angry. So I tried out a little exercise with them. We did lots of work on culture, and I got them to translate some sentences. So I'm going to ask you to have a go now. So get ready in the chat. And I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of translating. So first of all, tell me, what does a Brit really mean? Well, what does an Indian hear when a Brit says, I was a bit disappointed? So in the chat, what does an Indian hear when they hear a Brit say, I was a bit disappointed? I'm not seeing anything coming up in the chat, so I don't know if you're saying anything at all. So I'm going to press on. Well, I think an Indian probably thinks, well, it wasn't too bad, was it? But what you and I know, what native Brits think, that means I'm really angry. That's a hidden complaint. What does a Brit mean, do you think, if you say, that's very interesting? What does an Indian hear if you say, that's very interesting? That's really bad. That wasn't too bad. Yeah, not a big deal. I like it. It's all coming in. And what does a Brit really mean when they say that's very interesting? Not at all happy. Thank you, Derek, very much. Absolutely. I think it's an awful idea. And the last one. So I'm sure it's my fault. What does an Indian hear? Yeah, it's interesting, boring, curious. They think it's actually interesting. Absolutely. That's a little bit behind. So I'm sure it's our fault. An Indian probably thinks he's in the wrong. And actually what a Brit really means, I think, is it's totally your fault. But we don't like to admit it, do we? Okay. So the thing is that it's difficult to understand the emotional meaning behind language. And that's the thing I'd urge you to focus on. I've just finished a book by Lisa Feldman Barrett called How Emotions Are Made. And in it, she talks about how how human beings use words to shape the emotions of their environment, the people around them. We actually use language to shape how people feel. And those emotions are created through other people and our own, in combination with our own brains. So we've got to think deeply about the emotional impact of the words on us. So we know that language is about tribe and it's about culture, but it's also about your identity or your brand. So let's move on to the next bit. So if you think about your friends and family for a moment, let's think about the sorts of language that your family use. It's probably a bit different to the ones that the language that I use. And so you might have had things that a child mispronounced, or I don't know. My wife and I always call each other darling, and Lottie heard garling, and we use garling until this day. It's just stuck. So these little nuances in language that we use within our family and amongst our friends. But if we go back to when, to when William the Conqueror landed in England, the language that he found was quite a mongrel of languages. So there was Anglo-Saxon coming from sort of Northern Europe. There was also quite a lot of Norse words coming from these guys, the Vikings. And William the Conqueror brought Norman French, which is a modern form of Latin. And this combination of languages. So what happened when the Normans came and duffed up the English was Latin became the language of power. If you were anybody in England, in the court, in law, in business, then Latin was your language. That was the language of authority. And so that's what you adopted. Now, and what we found was that when new words were created which was generally by the educated elites, it was the French and Latin and later Greek that they started to adopt. And so those are the roots of quite a lot of the words that were created around the time. And these Latin origin words tend to be longer. The problem with it, why does it matter? Well, the problem with these longer words is that they feel like they're coming from a place of authority and people telling us what to do. And we don't like being told what to do we? But the problem is that Anglo-Saxon was suppressed. It went underground. And what that meant that it was mostly used within friends and family and in friendship groups. And so the Anglo-Saxon is actually the language that we trust more. So when we hear people using longer words, we don't trust it quite as much as we do the Anglo-Saxon. And you end up with ridiculous language like this, for example. So the operational documents for the project under discussion were inappropriately managed by the team leader. Lots of big Latin origin words. Wouldn't it be a bit more straightforward to say something like, Dave buggered up the paperwork on that job? So there's a complexity and a simplicity. And the thing is, what happens is that when people are trying to convey gravitas with their language, either in speech or in writing, they tend to use more of these Latin origin words. But they're the words that we don't trust as much. When we're being sincere, saying something like, I love you, we use the shorter Anglo-Saxon words. So this is really crucial because many of us come from professions like accountancy or law or a lot of spaces that use a lot of complex language. And that's what gets in the way of understanding and of connection. So let's move on from friends and family to organizations. And there are three trends that I want to talk about, three things that we need to be aware of. The first is that public language is becoming much less formal. So the internet has actually really changed how we write. And I find it fascinating to look. So we've got chat, we've got social media, we've got text, all sorts of different ways of communicating. What these are doing actually is they're combining spoken ways of communicating with writing. So related to the formal letters that we used to have in the olden days, they start to feel old-fashioned. And actually, it was a piece of discourse analysis with one of my clients, Legal & General, many years ago that kicked off a review of their language. What they found was that they were using a complexity of language that was actually keeping customers at bay, keeping them away. It was putting up a barrier between them. So are you putting up any barriers between you and your clients? So the second thing is that trust in business, in governments, in NGOs is actually and the media is an all-time low. The pandemic has accelerated this trend. I've been watching Edelman for the last few years, and it's really shocking, actually, that the major institutions are really not trusted by the public. What's really strange about this year's results is that actually business has had a slight rise. So brands have actually increased in trust and are seen as having a larger role in society, potentially. I think that gives us a huge opportunity, don't you? And the third thing to think about is about attention. There's a huge shortage of attention. We're bombarded with words, aren't we? From the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to sleep, even while we're asleep, if we're listening to podcasts. And the thing is that we've become extremely effective at filtering out all these messages that we're bombarded with all the time, haven't we? So there's a filter in the way, and that makes it hard for our messages to come through. Now, if you think about go back to human evolution. So modern humans emerged 200,000 years ago, probably more. That's the oldest fossils we can identify. And these are anatomically modern humans. So they looked and they appeared exactly like us. They had the same brain size. They probably communicated in a very similar way. The language would have been different, but anatomically modern humans. So we evolved. So for the last 200,000 years, we have basically been the same creatures, which is quite a staggering thought, isn't it? So if you cast yourself back, if we cast our minds back then, how many words do you think we came across back on the savannah? You can imagine it's a tiny, tiny fraction of what we're experiencing today. So this is something we need to be aware of, that we're not evolved to cope with all of this. And last of all, we've got a few trends that about this volume of words. So the American Marketing Society studies suggest that 6,000 to 10,000 brand messages are bombarding every person every day. I find that quite extraordinary. A British study shows that we switch screens 21 times an hour. And Microsoft study reckons that they claim that we have an 8-second attention span. Isn't that extraordinarily small? I mean, how does anybody get any work done? But it's not just that the attention is struggling. It's also that language has become devalued. In the era of fake news, we knew that Trump was lying to us, and yet not many people seem to care. So language has been, in public discourse, has become devalued. But there's another thing to be thinking about here, and that's about how our perceptions of language are coming across and what we expect of organizations, of business. Younger people in particular are particularly concerned about the social purpose behind the organizations that they shop with or buy from. I saw Gillette's UK chief exec, speaking at the Marketing Society just 3 weeks ago, and he was talking about their advertising campaign of about 18 months ago, tackling toxic masculinity and violence and sexism. And it caused a huge storm. I can remember him saying that he had got a torrent of abuse, actually, waited for that to die down, and then realized that actually most of the populace was supporting it. So I asked him a question. I said, how is this impacting on your values? It's all very well to communicate a message, but are you following it through in your behavior? I just hope that they are. So we know that language is deep. Language is about our tribe, our culture, and language is about our identity or our brand. So let's go on to the last section. Language is also about our comms and behavior. And much of my work is like modern day archaeology. I've got my trowel out and I'm scraping back layers of communication and behavior, and I'm looking at the brand and the culture and what's going on there underneath. When I work with global companies like Vodafone and Google and Aviva, I noticed that the language is as much about their culture and their brand as it is about how they communicate. The reason for this is multi. So you communicate your vision and strategy in language. You communicate all of the ideas in your head. Language is the way that you get those ideas into the minds of your people and into your organizations, into your clients. It's in your marketing. It's in your customer service. Language is enshrined in your terms and conditions. And that's why it's so deeply embedded within your culture. Language is about the signals that you send your organization and send to your clients. This is an example a colleague of mine sent me just recently, last year or so. Just think for a moment, what do you think this sign, what was behind this door? Maybe you can pop some ideas in the chat. What was behind a door saying strictly prohibited without permission and disciplinary procedures? Quite fierce language, isn't it? Well, imagine you're a student in a college and you're going to a first counselling session. Yes, this was actually on the door of a student counselling room in a college in London. Isn't that extraordinary? What signals do you think a sign like this might be sending to the students, but also to other staff, to colleagues around the organisation? And this is why I'm so interested in getting into the nooks and crannies, deep under what's going on, because there's so often a difference between how organizations perceive that they're communicating and actually the reality of their behavior. And this is why in my donut model, I'm trying to join up your brand and your communications with the culture and behavior. We need to consider them all together. So hopefully you've got a feel now for how I look at language and how I think about tone of voice. So let's go back to when I'm working with an organization, what actually happens. I use an approach called appreciative inquiry. These are the 4D stages of appreciative inquiry. And appreciative inquiry starts by looking at an organization at its best. And it was some training I did about 5 years ago that completely changed how I approach talking to my clients and understanding what's going on for them. And as consultants, as speakers, as trainers, you need to understand what's going on for your clients, don't you? So how does this work? Well, going back to the Vodafone Indian teams, I started by creating a 2-day workshop, appreciative inquiry workshop, where I get people telling stories of times that they've been at their very best at work, especially at Vodafone. And from those stories come a bunch of themes. And those themes tell us what's absolutely true about the organization. Those themes give us the beating heart of the organization. And it's absolute gold for creating something new. So we went on to create some training, and that rolled out across 1,000 people across the British web chat teams. And the result of that training was quite extraordinary. They increased their net promoter score, which is a customer service rating, by 15 to 20%, almost as soon as the training had finished. Complaints and escalations were down. The average chat was down 5% because they were more efficient. They were answering questions better. 40 to 50 people were leaving in the first year, and they knew that was saving at least £500,000 a year in salaries. So these are some of the really tangible results that we can get by focusing on language. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? But there are brands and companies that are getting it right and getting it wrong all the time, aren't they? Let's look at a few examples and see what can happen. So this was a Welsh bus company. I think they got a storm of abuse on Twitter, and this got taken down within about 24 hours. Luton Airport. Why do I have to stand in the queue in order to reduce the queue? Don't get that one. I was at Antalya when we could last fly, and I couldn't work out where gate 201 was. Is this a bank that's going to go bankrupt soon? And I only hope that customers tasted good. But more seriously, this is an example. So one of my colleagues was coming to see me in Nottingham. She was staying at the Ibis, or the Abyss, as they used to call it when I worked at Whitbread. And there's a real contrast in the tone of voice here, which I find quite interesting. So Ibis Nottingham is honoured to welcome you today to Ibis Nottingham Centre. It feels almost pompous, doesn't it? It's quite formal language. If you contrast this with an email that Nick got in the same week, Dear Nicola, on the lookout for a getaway, wanting to visit somewhere new and exciting, or indulge in a return trip, So there's a bounce and an energy and enthusiasm to that language that's in real contrast to that word honourable, isn't there? So I wonder, if you think about your communication within your teams and with your clients, do you think there could be any conflicts within your marketing, within your text, with any of your emails, even your terms and conditions? But there are brands who are really getting this right. And here are a few of my favourite examples. So Mac have just had an announcement last week. I don't know if anyone was watching it on Tuesday. I always watch them. I'm a sucker for it. I think what Apple tend to do is they get some sort of emotionally compelling message through, and then they communicate all the technicalities. And I think it's quite an art that they manage to do. They communicate tech with clarity, but also get something emotional in there, because otherwise we wouldn't be buying in our droves as we do, or not all of us anyway. But what about innocent drinks? They're almost a cliche now of tone of voice, because they pretty much created the field 20 odd years ago, nearly 20 years ago. It was around the time I was at Boots. And so they put really fun stuff on the back of packs. It's not for everybody, but let's try this. So back in the day, Napoleon Bonaparte used to drive the ladies wild with his good looks, small feet, and natty hats. I don't know what that's got to do with a smoothie, but it's fun. The Economist, I think, are a great example of an organisation that has consistently, for decades, conveyed complex information to ordinary people in a way that they can understand. I don't know how confident you're going to be in flying with Kalula, but I think I like the way they're having a bit of fun. This is the budget end of the airline. It wouldn't be on the posh end. When I was at Boots, we had a section, and we probably still do, called family planning. Does anyone know what family planning really means? What it really means is condoms and stuff like that. So we thought, this was an inner city store in Holborn, and we thought, why don't we refresh the language? Let's think about what's going to communicate to a younger audience in particular and feel more relevant and current. So we came up with sex and pregnancy. I think it got taken away eventually because the people on high felt a bit nervous about it, which you can understand why. But this is why language is so hard to change. And lastly here, an example of a brand who I'm looking at the moment. I'm working with a pet insurance company, and they're very interested in this company, Lemonade Insurance in the US. That's too small to see, but what they do is in the terms and conditions, they have some fun. So a sentence here, congratulations, you got yourself a Lemonade renter's insurance policy. We want to make sure you know what you're getting for your $5 to $20 a month. So we did our best to make this policy short and sweet. Isn't that refreshing language for terms and conditions? And I think it proves that you can apply tone of voice and you can apply approach to language to any areas of language that you might be tackling. Okay. So go and check out Lemonade online because their stuff is really, really interesting. So language, I think, can change the world. Language can change your world. Come away from today and think about the first words that you speak, maybe to your partner or your kids or your friends. Could you put those words differently? Could you find a different way to say them and see if you get a different result? Because we're having this impact on people all the time we say something. Go home and think about it and leave this session thinking about how language is tribal, language is about your identity, and language reveals your truth. So I want you to think about what your truth is. What truth is coming through when you communicate? And the way to tie this together is to start by thinking about your culture, your tribe. Who belongs in your team? Who's in and who's out? Then think about your brand, the expression, your identity. And finally, you can start plowing that into your communication and the way that you behave day to day with your customers. Now, if you want to make this really practical, I've piled it all into my free ebook, Cut the Crap How to Write So People Buy. I've got my Afia Tone 5-step process, which helps you think about your audience, how you're going to speak to what you want to get from them, what is going to be in their interest, arrange your story, and then craft your tone. And you can pick that up for free. We haven't got it in the vault, but you can go to my links and you can get it there. There's no sign in or anything like that. You can just download it. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, Ben. I've been absolutely writing notes like mad and watching the chat, and it's really, really active. Lots and lots of great thoughts in there. Because I find the LGBT community is one of the worst for inventing all sorts of labels and things. I now have to say that I am AMAB, which is assigned male at birth, and I now define as trans, feminine, non-binary. There are about 100 different gender labels. Nobody understands any of them. Utterly and totally confusing. We have to sort that. So we've got a little bit of chance for some questions here. There's some loads and loads of applause going up on the same. So, first question I saw coming up in the chat, Ben. Can you tell us? You mentioned a book,
Yes,
earlier on, and everybody wanted to know what was that book.
Yep, that's How Emotions Are Made. Lisa Feldman Barrett. I listened to it. It's quite long. I listened to it on audio. It was 14 hours, but I was shoveling mushroom compost onto my garden while I did it, so that helped. It's a fascinating insight, and I compared notes with Linda Shaw afterwards because it's really what's latest in neuroscience, and it's fascinating to understand how emotions are created, and they are created by the brain.
Excellent. Can I just suggest if anybody's got questions, please put them into the Q&A section. So just where you see chat, click. I've got another question coming out. Absolutely great. More questions, the better. We've got a few minutes now to. We've got quite a few minutes. We can ask Ben all sorts of things, and I'll try and learn.
Somebody's just. Eamon's just asking about links, Ricky. So I'll just chuck that one in. So the links is LIINKS. And it's links.com/Ben Afia. One word.
Okay.
I'll pop it in the chat later. Thank you, Kosia.
Somebody said, have you got any recommended reading on appreciative inquiry?
I will gather some stuff. Now, appreciative inquiry is interesting. It's fascinating. We should all honestly know about it. It really has changed how I work. It's literally changed my life. It starts by asking what's already working rather than getting into the negativity spiral that we get in organizations by constantly diagnosing problems and prescribing solutions and arguing about what's going wrong. It starts by asking what's already working and what do we like at our best. So I will find some links and put it in there. It's the 4D cycle. I've got an article on my website, which I'll post as well, which gives you the basic overview, some lovely principles. And one of the core principles to it is that words create worlds. And this apes actually what Lisa Feldman Barrett's research is showing, that words really do create our own worlds, but they also create our collective sense of reality.
Excellent. One of the things I used to be in sales, Ben, and one of the things I found was that if I went into a sales meeting and I didn't understand the corporate language, the words that they use. I worked in the financial service industry, packed
Mm.
with acronyms and different language. If you didn't understand that, you didn't get trust.
No.
Is that still what you would find today, you think?
It's a really tricky balance. So industries and professions have jargon, and many of the clients I work with are really afraid to let go of that jargon. They worry that if they don't use their words, they're not going to appear expert. So I get that. I get that absolutely, because when we communicate, we're trying to convey gravitas, aren't we? We're trying to convey expertise. So that is a problem. However, I'd also think that we need to communicate in a way that our audience are going to understand. And I think we appear more intelligent, actually, if we do. You know, one of the examples I talk about in my training sessions is, if you think about an economics professor interviewed on Newsnight, they're not usually there because they're using big words. They're usually there because A, they're a professor and they're an expert, but B, because they can communicate effectively on TV to a general public. I should update that example with a pandemic example, shouldn't I? I should think of one of the doctors or the researchers working on the pandemic. So people who are able to communicate clearly actually convey more expertise. And actually, if I can find it as well, there is some recent research that shows, I think Mark Lee found this article, actually, this paper, showing that people using more complex language are seen as less competent. And it's really interesting that people that are entering their professions and trying to attain this gravitas tend to use more big language, and it's the more senior people who can let go of it. And that's what I found in my training. If I'm training a leadership team, they get it immediately. All I have to help them think is, how do we want to feel to our customers? How do we want our customers to feel? They immediately get it.
But sure, I mean, one of the things I found, having worked in the financial services as an example, there is lots and lots of jargon that actually simplifies communication. I don't have to explain complex ideas, because I can actually package it up into a simple piece of jargon. You understand it, I understand it, we can have a conversation. If I talk to a client, they don't have a clue what I'm talking about. So how do we tackle that difference where I want efficiency when I'm talking to my colleagues, but I need to communicate?
I've got a good example of this, actually. So I mentioned Legal and General. I was working with them 15, 16 years ago. And what I found in various pieces of communication was that they had two definitions for the word maturity. Maturity meant something different for a pension policy versus a life insurance policy. And I tried to point out to them that if you have two definitions of one word internally, how on earth can you expect customers to understand? So yes, I get it. So maturity in financial services, in insurance companies, has a specific legal definition, although obviously there's two legal definitions within Legal and General. But that doesn't mean we should just use them as shorthand. And what I actually helped L&G to do was to turn that one word into a paragraph. Because actually, if you say maturity to your average customer, they're not really, they'll have an idea, but they don't know specifically what you mean. And the thing is that insurance and pensions are about trust. You need to trust that they're going to do what you bought. And you don't get trust by communicating unclearly. So it is tricky. And there is jargon that we need to be aware of, but I try to translate it wherever possible. And actually, one company that's doing that really well at the moment, financial services-wise, Monzo Bank. If you have a look at Monzo Bank, their tone of voice is published online. And I know the guy who heads up copy. It's interesting that the head of customer experience, his title is head of copywriting and customer experience. And I've never seen that before. It's quite fascinating. And I know that he's trained more than 250 people around that business. So they really believe that language is core to how they create their product, their service, and how they deliver it and make customers happy with it.
Okay, we've got a few questions coming up here. I'm going to bring in from there. Alan Stevens has asked, how would you adapt language for cross-cultural presenting, such as to virtual audiences in several continents simultaneously?
Yeah. Cross-culture does get tricky, and most of my work is with larger businesses, so they tend to be international, so it comes up a lot. The problem with cross-cultural communication is about translation and how literally things are going to be translated and how things are going to be interpreted in different cultures. So we do have to be really careful. And when I'm working on tone of voice, which is kind of defining the personality of the brand, with most brands, we want a little bit of color. We want some sense of personality, unless they're a completely generic brand and don't have any. And many companies are like they're just mass market. So how do we convey personality? And the thing is, it's very hard to get personality across in language without using some form of colloquialism. So what I tend to do is try and think locally and globally. And so 6 or 7 years ago, I worked with the IT security company Sophos. So you've got Norton Antivirus and McAfee, and then Sophos are the number 3 in that market, or they were at the time, B2B. But they're in every country in the world. And so the way that we tackled that was we thought about getting a consistent brand idea for them. So we thought about what the message, the overarching message was, but then we gave each country permission or license to then interpret that for their local audience. Now, that's a bit more tricky when you're running an event, when you've got people from all over the world. But I think the answer, Alan, is to be thinking about those colloquialisms and how they might be interpreted and understood in different countries. So, and unfortunately, the only way around it really is to think about dumbing those down a little bit, unfortunately, which can be tricky because colloquialism gives you color, expresses passion, it gives richness to communication. So it's tricky.
It makes us think a lot more about how we're going to develop speeches when we have no idea where people are from. So
one way. Sorry, Ricky. Just to follow that. So one way I think about it when I'm delivering internationally. So I talked about a speech I was doing in Sweden. And I mean, I have to think about it when I'm speaking to American audiences because we know we have to be very careful about swearing. And I know there are some words I use in my speech, which to some audiences are not going to be comfortable, but I find it quite hard to add the color without. So I won't overstep a certain line. And I accept that some words are not going to come across, but the general flow hopefully will.
Yes. Yeah, I've Alan Pease is a good friend, and he crosses that line very often.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at. Oops, what have we got? Another question here. You mentioned tone. How is this developed? Charles has asked.
Yeah. So in the kind of the donut model, and I was thinking of Michelle Mills Porter here actually, because when I was talking to her about my donut, she said, "Don't use the word donut, Ben. In my family, we say, oh, you're a donut," and it's like it's almost like it's a denigration. But I like it anyway. So we've got culture, we've got brand, communication, and behaviour. Now, where did this come from? So when I was at Boots, I was managing writing. I was looking, and I got to work on tone of voice. And what I quickly realized that tone of voice is just a document. It is only a document unless people are actually using it. So the change that you're trying to create is that for you personally to be writing differently. So thinking about the choice of words, the choice of sentences, the choice of phrases that give the personality and the value and show the values that you're hoping for. So the model starts with culture because it's about understanding who you are and what you're like at your best and who's going to be in and out of your tribe. And then the brand part of the donut is thinking about all sorts of elements of brand strategy, vision, mission, values, and all of that stuff. But tone of voice is the written expression of that. So the first step, as I said, is to understand what you're like at your best, understand who you are, what's your culture, who's your tribe, and then think about the kind of language that feels right for you and that's going to communicate and connect with that audience. So if you're speaking to a younger audience, so we talked about Monzo Bank. Monzo set out to start talking to a millennial audience. They've spread far beyond that. I've banked with Monzo. I think they're fantastic. And they set out to use a simpler, more straightforward language and something that's more energetic and more engaging, with shorter sentences, smaller words, less of the jargon. So it starts from within. Tone of voice really starts from within. You've got to start the soul searching, and then it's about getting principles down for the kind of language that you want to use more consistently. And it might just be you using it on your own if you're small, or it might be to use with your team if you've got a virtual assistant or a marketer or any of those people. So it's about creating some guidelines that help guide those people day to day.
Excellent. I think that to some extent answers a question here. Any tips for getting out of the habit of speaking in a corporate tone and making it real? And that sounds as if that's pretty much this.
That there's a difference to that question actually, which is quite interesting. So in my training, what I found over the years is that it's actually quite hard for people to change how they write, because our spoken expression and our written expression is a part of our personality. I put on a blazer this morning because I wanted to smarten myself up a bit, but I didn't wear a shirt, and that's a conscious choice. So my style is relatively informal and my tone of voice is naturally informal, but I didn't want to look shabby for my lovely audience. And so what I come across in businesses and organizations is people who have a persona, and it's like they're putting on their suit and going to work, which maybe happens less and less these days, but it's like putting on a suit. And if you're used to putting on a suit and dressing up to go to work, then it's going to be quite hard. And a couple of interesting examples. So I was training at Eon years ago, the energy company, and I remember having somebody in a training session in customer service. And we were talking about using, energy's full of big words and complex language, and they wanted to become more simple, more warm, more human. And this lady said to me, she was quite young, she was in her 20s, not an older, more formal person. That's not to say that all older people are formal, but anyway, you get my point. She said, Ben, I'm really feeling uncomfortable about this warmer style of voice. I'm not a nice person. That's why I'm a debt collector. I was like, bloody hell, what do you do about that? Another example was I actually took on a client director who used to be a client. She was a marketing director at one of my clients, and she joined me, and I actually got this. I made a big mistake. So she had huge experience, and she was one of my clients and one of my advocates for many years. So she was with me about 9 months, and I said to her, look, get your feet under the table, meet all the clients, let's get a feel for all the projects so that you're running everything, and then we can work on the writing. What I should have done it the other way around. I should have said, first, you need to learn to write like me, because Afia is my business. You're representing me and the rest of the team that I've picked. So you need to write similarly to me. If I'd done that at the start, she might not have lasted 9 months. She might have left a lot earlier, because in the end, her corporate way of being, because she'd been in corporate for 30 years, she found very hard to let go of. And she couldn't in the end. It just wasn't her.
I was personally was going to do a PhD, and I found that by the time I'd completed my master's, my language had changed so much because of the way I was being coached to write that my speaking was deteriorating. And I actually decided not to carry on because I felt it was going to block my ability to communicate effectively.
Well, and so this is where, so the trainers amongst you will understand I can't remember the cycle, competence, incompetence sort of cycle. And so what I do find is I have to tell people that, look, you're going to slow down to start with. And if you've got people in customer service that you train, if I've got lots of people in the customer service team, we have to have the leadership relax the KPIs and things like that. They have to be able to answer fewer calls a day, because it's going to take them time to adopt the tone. It's difficult. It takes a while to build the habit. The way I did this, when I was at Boots, I changed my writing dramatically. I was a very, very average marketing writer when I joined Boots, but I got to work with some of the best copywriters in the land, and they taught me over 3 years, and it transformed how I write. So I would take something like trying to write with shorter sentences. So I tend to say that an average sentence of maybe 15 to 20 words, online, probably 10 to 12 is better. Now, this is an average. You can have some longer, some very short, but an average. And so I practiced that for a month. I just focused on it for a month. The other one that is really hard is, I talk about a lot, is active language. I mentioned it in the talk. Active versus passive language. So a passive sentence might be something like, a letter will be sent. A letter will be sent. Now, in that sentence, you don't know who's sending the letter, do you? It's a very flat, corporate sounding sentence. What about if you said, I'll write to you? I'll write to you. How different does that feel? So an active sentence does lots of things for you. It gives more energy to the sentence. It's clear who's writing and who's reading, and it makes the sentence clearer. So I found it very difficult to adopt that tone. If anyone had like an English degree, you will probably recognize, but I didn't do an English degree, and I was brought, I was in schools in Britain in 70s and 80s when we didn't learn grammar anymore. So I found it really hard to get my head around that. I spent 3 months focusing on just practicing active language. But over time, it changes slowly, and it changes how you speak, it changes how you write, and you can make conscious choices about what you want that to be. And it's practice.
That's a good reason for using Grammarly, which keeps on telling me I am using an active.
Sometimes it's wrong, though. I disagree with Grammarly sometimes.
A quick humorous question is coming from Jeremy Nicholas. What is your favourite Indiana Jones film?
The Temple of Doom. I have no idea what.
Got that.
I actually thought of getting the Wybrin Hap and the whip just for a bit of theatre, but I left it too late.
So I've got language reveals your truth. Have you any advice redefine things not to use, say, address up front?
Can you just give me that one again?
Language
Language.
reveals your truth. Have you any advice to redefinite things not to use, say, address up front? Things, what I think what I'm saying
Yes.
is are the things that we really shouldn't say, shouldn't do.
Yeah. I think things are changing. I think the pandemic is changing things, and I think the last 2 decades of internet have changed things. They've made things more transparent. And so the corporates, the businesses that we work with are used to kind of packaging messages, if you like, and sort of throwing them over the parapet and hoping that they land. And I think that those days are over of thinking about communication in a very traditional sense. And the reason for that is that our customers and our clients are picking up signals about us from all over the place, through our social media, they're chatting to our colleagues, they're chatting to people that we work with. So there are so many other sources of information about us that actually I think it's dangerous to hide. So I find it really interesting, for example, to when the BBC, so I think I'm the only person I know of my kind of age who still listens to Radio 1 on Friday night. I like the dance, the Annie Mac and Pete Tong and all that. And I heard yesterday that Annie Mac's leaving. But what she didn't say was, I'm leaving and Danny Howard is taking over for me. She says that from July, Danny Howard will be taking the 6 to 8 p.m. slot. The BBC seem to have this way of saying this is what's going to happen, but not why. And I then look up some news stories and I find that actually they have said that she's leaving after 17 years at Radio 1. I find that very strange. Why can she not just say, I've been here for 17 years. It's been amazing. Danny Howard's stepping in for me. I'm on a different journey. I think we've got to be honest. And this is the problem. Language really does reveal the truth. People are sensing in our words what's really going on. We can't pull the wool over people's eyes. And I think this is what I'm talking about when I refer to the emotional meaning behind language. We're picking up these nuances. Human beings are very tuned in to picking up these nuances in each other's language. We know when somebody's pulling the wool over our eyes. We know when someone's being slightly sarcastic. We know when they're being evasive. We can just sense it, and it reduces trust.
That leads us on to another question that Rebecca Jones has asked, which I think is really interesting. How do you manage to speak to a variety of ages in web copy?
Yeah, interesting. That is really tricky, really, really tricky, because there are expectations at different age groups. So the way that we tackle this at Boots, and this is quite a few years ago, this is nearly 20 years ago now, but so 20 years ago, people who were maybe 50 and above, so 70 and above now, would have learnt grammar more formally at school, all of them. A bit like my kids are. So my kids are 14 and 17, and they've been doing so much grammar. They know more grammar than me. And I've built a business out of language, but I haven't needed it. Anyway, don't get me started on that. But so we knew that a certain generation would expect certain standards of grammar. So we wouldn't use contractions or elisions like I'll and we'll and you'll, because that's seen as less formal. But for a younger audience, we absolutely would. And I would tend to say, use contractions or elisions if you want to be more conversational and more human. They come up naturally in speech, and there's no rule against them. It's actually an issue of style. So I think it's about considering that audience and then trying to meet their needs, which isn't quite an answer. But if you're talking to both an old and a young audience, then you don't go too young, because there'll be things that will trigger people who are older. But similarly, you don't want to sound old and fusty. One way on the web is to have different landing pages. So to have either different websites or different products tailored to different people. So some websites will say, are you this kind of customer or are you that kind of customer? So that can be one way to tackle it. But it's really thinking about what your audience will expect and what they'll notice, because you don't want your language to trip them up and to get them angry. If they're expecting a formality and you're very informal, you're not going to have the impact that you want.
Yeah, my partner's writing a novel aimed at younger people, and it's very difficult for them to try and find the language because their children have already grown up. So what are kids, very young kids, doing now is totally different, because they've grown up with social media as part of their life, and they've learned to communicate by cutting out all the vowels and.
So we have to be very sensitive to it, and ideally not too precious about language, because I do come across people who are very passionate about English and a certain and writing to a certain standard. But the thing is that language is evolving all the time. And actually, case in point, so Alistair Greener posted on LinkedIn last night a wonderful post about some of the words that Shakespeare created. I wonder if somebody can chuck in the chat some of the examples, because there are words that he mentioned that Shakespeare invented. So what would that be, 500 years ago or so?
Bedazzled was one of his.
Bedazzled, that was one. And these are words that actually sound quite contemporary, and I find that fascinating. So we have to accept that language is evolving, and the correct grammar is what people are using. It's what people use in the culture. It's what people in the tribe are actually using. So the shortenings and the slang and the things that kids are using now, I know that that's leaking into the workplace. In customer service teams, my clients have terrible trouble with younger people coming in, and they're using all sorts of inappropriate colloquialisms with customers, and they're trying to get rid of them. But what they are hopefully doing, what they need to be doing, is training them to tune into individual customers and respond in the way that they're writing to them. And I do this when I'm onto customer service. I try to ape the person who I'm working with. I'm trying to out customer service the customer service person.
I think that's a perfect place at which to stay. We have to be adaptive. We have to be listening, don't we? And adapting to who we're talking to and to the team we're into. Ben, thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. There's many questions here, and I hope maybe you'll be able to sort of answer a few of those later on.
Absolutely.
If you have a moment, they're in the chat.